Okay, we are recording. Let me make this treacherous trek on top of this stool. I will use this here. We finished yesterday talking about hunter-gatherers and distributing wealth. Okay, and
that thing is like wobbling, man.
It is wobbling, buddy. I'm way up high here, right where it could break.
You got some very bad options for stool.
Honestly, it's terrible. Okay, we finished off talking about the potluck ceremony, which was a indigenous attempt at redistributing wealth, because one of the problems many societies discovered is that wealth accumulates into the hands of a small group of people, regardless of whether or not capitalism exists, right? Because for these coastal indigenous groups, they did not have capitalism. You know, they didn't even have what we're going to look at next, agrarian society, so they weren't, many of them probably weren't stable, staying in one spot. So accumulation of wealth still gathered into the hands of a few groups of people. Continuing on where we left off, so looking at the history of wealth and trade and how people understand that, moving into agrarian societies. So this would be the transition from hunter-gatherer to agrarian. Anyone have an idea what agrarian means? What? Okay, it's also on there. So agrarian society, so right there, I should probably bold that at some point. Agrarian means agricultural. It means they grew their food. So about 10 to 12,000 years ago, it's not really fully understood how this happened, but human societies started learning how to grow their own food. Okay, which meant that rather than chasing around animals, following herds, following the movement of animals, human beings started settling in areas and they started growing crops. Once they did that, about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, you had actual societies or city developments start to form. Okay? And so how this changed the understanding of wealth and the understanding of trade is that in terms of wealth, that once people were stable, they could start amassing amounts of wealth, right? So if you had more food than other people, you could then trade that and you could gain things that were of wealth. So for agrarian people, wealth then became the effective and efficient cultivation of land and animals. Do we understand what that means? Effective and efficient, right? So somebody who's doing their job very well, cultivation of land and animals. So cultivating land would be like one farmer does a really good job, the other farmer is a little lazy. When it's time to plant the seed, they just want to lay in bed. When it's time to harvest, they think, I'm too tired, right? They're not properly cultivating their land or their animals. And so in essence, just food production is what would be considered wealth, right? Because we need that to survive. Individual ability also remained an indicator of wealth, but was diversified over numerous tasks a person could do. This is where we start to begin emphasizing productivity and a person's productive capacity. So if you're a good farmer, you'll likely be wealthier, right? And that's how wealth started to accumulate in agrarian societies. Again, I have some sources at the bottom of this if you want to read and look into more of that. Okay, so an increased cultivation of land and animals would lead to an increase in resources because humans are now settled in cities. Wealth can be accumulated and amassed, right? And so this is kind of where you start to see kingdoms forming. This is where you start to see empires forming because some groups are more effective and more efficient than other groups. Obviously, there are still things that are occurring during this time period, like, there's likely people still warring and raiding one another. So one of the histories that goes with when agrarian societies, so people who are stable, and hunter-gatherer societies, people who are more nomadic, one of the issues that tends to occur is that, let's say you're a hunter-gatherer and there's no animals to hunt, but you know that a 2-day walk that way, there's a group of people who grow their food. What are you going to do? Any guesses? You can't find animals to hunt, but you know that there's people over there that grow food.
You're going to go eat them.
You might walk away. There's a whole research knowledge on cannibalism and the lack of protein, which we won't get into, but you're probably going to go over there. You might steal from them, right? Because, you know, maybe you're not as ethical as we are now, right? Like, now we know that there's well, we built a society that has consequences for stealing, more or less. And our culture emphasizes that you shouldn't steal from people because it creates societal problems, right? So that's one of the tensions that exist between agrarian and hunter-gatherer societies, right? Those with more capacity or more competency may have been given more responsibility. So eventually, once you have cities forming, some people with skills or eventually connections, whatever, with how people started to understand nobility and kingdoms, which is a very fascinating history as well. Some people would have been given a responsibility to help build certain structures, right? That could be temples, that could be castles, whatever it is, right? Organizing other people and maintaining order, right? So society starts to stratify, right? You no longer have just everyone as egalitarian or equal in hunter-gatherer societies. You now have some people who have more things of value than others, right? So this is where, like with some of our explanations of what a wealthy person is yesterday, this is where you start to see that physical, tangible wealth start to collect, right? I don't know when money was invented or when they started trading for money. I should probably look into that. I think that would have happened within the last 12,000 years, perhaps more. But definitely once you start to see like the Mesopotamian societies, Egyptian societies, ancient Greece and Rome, once you see these kingdoms start to form, right? There was kingdoms in South America as well, in Africa as well. That's when you would start to see this shift take place in status of individuals in society and the wealth that they had, right? These societies begin to see more trade, development of jobs and classes. So Adam Smith, who was the founder of capitalism, who wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, he focused on this thing called specialization. So when there's surplus resources, when not everyone is making and growing food all the time, you can specialize, right? So one person can get really good at one thing and another person can do two completely things, or there's specialization in creation, right? So like this shoe, for example, 200, 300 years ago, somebody might be known as a cobbler, and so they just make shoes, right? Whereas in a modern society, the laces might be created in a factory somewhere else. So someone's job is literally just to, I don't know, make shoelaces. The leather is produced at a farm in a different country. It's tanned somewhere, it's treated somewhere. Someone else grows the crop, right? So this is specialization. You start to see that with agrarian societies. You might also see religions started to form around the last 12,000 years. You have kingdoms and rulers as well. And eventually in the last couple hundred years, you have this last bit here. So with less time being spent looking for food, so hunter-gatherers, essentially they spend all their time just looking for food, right? Because the animals are always moving. It takes a long, has anyone gone hunting? A couple of you? How long do you spend looking for an animal? 3 hours, 2 hours, 3 hours?
3 hours if you're waiting.
Right? Any of you gone hunting for 6 to 12 hours? It's just kind of waiting, right?
Yeah.
Now imagine, because like you have a gun, I'm assuming, and you shoot the animal, what happens to it? It just drops, right? It dies instantly. But like what if you had to get within 30 yards of it to throw a spear? How much longer do you think it would take you to hunt food?
Days.
Could take you days, right? Any guesses on how ancient humans actually hunted their food?
They followed them like herds, and then
Yeah.
they would chase them off cliffs.
So head smash and buffalo jump, do we know about this? This is in southern Alberta. So some groups figured out like these visual, I don't think many people know this, but it's actually, if you're on the area, it's an optical illusion. So it looks like the hills are just going, but there's a big cliff drop off, and the bison can't tell that. And bison are pretty heavy, so once they start running, they can't stop and slow down really easily. And so they would just run herds of bison off cliffs. There's also various strategies of like there are anthropological sites where hunter-gatherers they created artificial places for herds of bison to run into, and then they would have people behind, you know, they would construct some sort of camouflage, and as the bison get herded into this funnel, people would come out and they'd throw out spears. But oftentimes that animal, the humans are chasing that animal for like a day or two. So imagine, instead of going to the fridge to get your food, you have to wait 1 to 3 days to get food, right? So you're always looking for food. You're always following animals. In agrarian societies, eventually in the last 500, particularly the last 300-400 years, because we industrialized, and that's the next slide that we'll talk about, less people are growing food. So for example, what that allows now, which some of you might not like and feel miserable for, is because we have modern technology, all of you can go to school. You can sit here, you can learn how to read, you can learn how to write, you can learn to do math, you can learn things about science, and then you can specialize, right? Some of you might go into the trades, right? You might learn a skill. Some of you might choose to go to college or university. Some of you might become entrepreneurs. Some of you might pursue the arts, right? You can specialize in all these different things. And a lot of that is allowed because with agrarian societies, we spend less time looking for food and we have more free time. We have more resources available to us, right? Particularly human resources. Okay. Which then adds complexity into social structures within the society, right? So in hunter-gatherer societies, things are very